Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
Welcome back to Diggers and Dreamers podcast, where we are welcoming Chris and Barbara for part 2 of our memories of setting up People in Common. In this episode, the community takes on the massive task of renovating an old mill just outside of Burnley. We also get to hear about the legendary Rapid Transformations, a group of communards who use their summers to travel around taking on roofing jobs for other communities, all for the cost of a bottle of whisky and somewhere to pitch their sauna. As always, a great listen. Welcome back, Chris and Barbara. Last time we recorded, we were talking about the People in Common community celebrating its 50th this year, 2024. And I thought we would pick up where we left off, which was around about the time where the community had already established itself and was living in a series of different houses up in Burnley. And you were looking at a mill. I think that's where we were. So I don't know if either of you want to kick off from that point.
There's a photograph. I was looking through the photographs the other day for this exhibition that we're putting together for the 50th anniversary. And there is a photograph entitled "The Day We Bought the Mill," which interestingly has a couple of People in Common members, Dave Traynor from Lauriston and Nicholas Albury, pointing into the distance as if this is our land. I wasn't around at that point. I mean, I don't know how big an event it was. Do you remember? Were you there on that day?
I think I was there on that day. I think the buying of the mills was a whole issue of itself, in that it took about a year to buy it. We didn't have. I think they wanted 10,000 for it, and we didn't have 10,000. And it was part of a big estate, and they were breaking up that estate. So we asked amongst our friends and other communes and so on, and said, who can lend us a bit of money? And after perhaps 6 months or so, we'd got together 5,000 or 7,000. So we put in an offer for 7,000. And after due deliberations, they accepted it, which was quite amazing, really. That was in 1977. And it was quite an auspicious day in People in Common, in that there were several other things that happened that day, which I can't currently bring to mind. But it was other housing, purchasing things came through, perhaps land registry but there were 2 or 3 things on that day in 1977, which was
just to give you a picture of what we bought, Kirsten. This is a 3.5-story derelict building with a sort of extension on one end, which had a huge boiler for a steam engine in, and what must have been a 30-foot, 40-foot high chimney.
Circular chimney, and it's quite special.
Yeah, and a 3.5-acre field that had sheep on it, sitting on the edge of the River Calder, just outside Padiham, which is an extension of Burnley, really.
So not a modest undertaking by any means. I mean, this is massive. And in fact, I have seen the photographs because I've read your book, Chris, A Life in Common, which if anyone's interested, we'll probably put a link into that in the chat underneath the podcast. But I've seen a photograph, and when you bought it, derelict is not the word. I mean, it was really one heck of a project. Do you remember sort of the beginning of that project and thinking about sort of clearing out that space?
Yeah, we did. We had some shovels. Pigeon shit, yeah.
Yeah, it had been being used as a huge chicken shed before, and the roof was propped up and riddled with woodworm. I mean, you're right, and there were.
But the props were not very substantial, really, and the woodworm was in very. It was built of oak, and I mean, one of the tasks we did early on, because we didn't really know what to do and where to start, was to start hacking off the rotten oak around the beams. And when you got inside of the sapwood, it was so hard you couldn't, the tools didn't touch it really. And that was quite interesting, because just to find out that oak, as it gets mature, gets harder and harder, and you don't need the sapwood. But we did do a lot of propping. We hired or bought. I think we went to various what are they called, auctions, and bought quite a few acro props, which we sort of refurbished and oiled and greased and put them under the beams to make us feel secure when we were walking in there.
Quite incredible. I mean, it's a number of, was it 3 floors? 3 significant floors.
There was a basement and 3 floors.
Oh,
but because it was built into a hill, you could go in at the ground level into the basement.
There was a half basement, yeah.
Well, it was all the way. Oh, yeah. Well, maybe it was sort of half. Yeah.
But even so, I mean, that's massive. How many of you were working on it? Like, how did you even begin to kind of have a plan? Did you have someone who drew up a plan?
We were at a gathering and someone said to us, have you ever thought of international work camps?
Right.
I mean, initially, what we did initially was, when I first joined, was we started in a sort of fit of enthusiasm growing vegetables out on the field. Yes. Just digging up turfs, and because it was on a sort of allotment scale, going, this is what we're going to do when we live here. And in some ways, the working out what to do with the building was much harder. And I mean, after you'd sort of made it so it wasn't going to fall down, you'd got to think about plans. We'd all got to agree by consensus what those plans would be. And we tried to get improvement grants. It was the era when you could get improvement grants to do up your house from the local council. But because it wasn't a house, it was a old industrial building, it was discretionary whether the council gave you the grant. It wasn't automatic. So we, after quite a long time, decided we would design it as if it was 6 flats, rather than even if we were going to live in it as one communal house, in order to try and get 6 improvement grants. So that was our plan, you see, to finance it by getting grants from the council. Because it was discretionary and because it was quite late on in the grant programme, I mean, we must have been talking early 80s when we applied for planning permission. The council just turned us down completely.
But all of them, they didn't say you can have one. They said you can have none.
They said
I think they gave us an insulation grant for one of them.
They gave us £60 insulation grant. It's in my book.
Oh, the generosity!
We nearly sent it back with a very terse note. How the bloody hell do you expect us to do this? But it was 60 quid is 60 quid.
So you still had a mammoth task ahead of you. And Barbara, you just mentioned that you'd been to a gathering and the international work camps. Do you want to tell us what those are before sort of for anyone who hasn't heard of that before?
Chris will probably have to help me out here. It's an international organisation, and it brings together volunteers from any country in the world, pretty much, to go to a country and lend their work for 2 weeks. And on your side of it, you have to provide them with somewhere to stay and sort of educational stuff and a few trips, food. And a lot of them will take place in like developing countries and so on. But for us, we were building a cooperative utopia, if you will. And that's what we advertised it as. And we have people come from India, Africa, all over Europe, mixed, men, women. And we ran 10 work camps, perhaps, over the years. And they were absolutely fascinating. Just, it threw up all sorts of interesting issues, reflecting people's upbringing, whether it was their, who does the cooking at home sort of thing. Can they cook here? Somebody once went home because they couldn't cope with cooking, for instance. But it also showed the different amounts of money that people were living on. And so some work camps, they'd set up a voluntary income pool so that they could all go to the pub and enjoy something. Whereas some people who managed to get there but didn't have any spending money. So from that point of view, it was like intense relations between different countries. It was fantastic. People shared their experiences, what they ate. And from our part, we gained some unskilled, generally, sort of 2 weeks of labour out of people. And then we'd go off into the dales and places like that and take people for walks in the countryside, or might go to a museum and visit a museum and so on. So they were tremendously inspiring, I think, for all of us, for those of us running it and the people who came. Yeah.
Do you have memories of the international work camps, Chris?
Yeah, part of what was going on at the same time was the whole sort of 1980s CND peace movement, and bringing together people from all over Europe and as Barbara said, Africa, India, felt like a part of that, reaching out over borders. I mean, we had people from the Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Turkey, former Yugoslavia. So it really did feel like a peace building exercise as well. I mean, I've got all sorts of memories of it. And Barbara's right, it was challenging both ways. It was challenging to us. We had to step up and organise a whole, 10, 15 people as a work team who'd never worked together before. And I mean, we weren't skilled builders at that stage in any way, really. We were learning on the job. And we were expecting them to live in a derelict mill. I mean, we had a caravan that we'd got from a theatre company, and we had tents on the field, and most of them were up for it. I mean,
Did you have people who stayed? Did you have people who went beyond the 2 weeks and just sort of stayed with you, or was that not how it worked?
No.
Only one, a Turkish guy, came back later afterwards, but no, not really. They were all on a 2-week break, doing something interesting, students, or often the people from developing countries, this was the only way they could afford a holiday.
Fascinating that you've got people from developing countries coming to help you build your mill. which is sort of like the backwards version of like voluntary services overseas of everybody going out doing.
Yes.
Yeah, it must be fascinating.
At times, if they were third world in the old way of describing it, we were definitely fourth world. There were people for whom meat eating was a status and couldn't understand why we voluntarily ran a vegetarian kitchen. Why would you not eat meat if you can afford it? Yeah. Why are you doing manual work if you've got a degree? They're a real clash of cultures in some cases. But without them, we would have never got to a stage where we thought we could actually convert the mill.
So you were bringing in bringing in work camps, working with sort of international workforces on sort of 2-week rotations. Did you see, was there a sort of shift at some point where you upskilled? I mean, I remember in the last time we recorded, you talked about people going off and doing things like plastering courses and plumbing. How did that all develop?
Well, before we go back, so we did it on an annual basis, so it wasn't continuous. It was like, what should we do with this year's work camp? And we'd do things like, well, maybe put sand in the floor or do plasterboarding, things that you could learn pretty quickly. I think going back to the skills, we'd done some of these courses and we'd done some development. I mean, it isn't the case that we were completely unskilled. By the time we started on the mill, we'd got a skilled joiner and a skilled plasterer and a skilled enough plumber and an electrician. Like the skills were sort of accumulating. And those of us who were doing the apprentices, we'd sort of got to that level too. So we were sort of, I'd say there were about 8 of us with skills, weren't there? Sort of.
I mean, the work camps lasted for over a decade every year, pretty much, from I don't know, 79, I don't know, through to the early 90s. So, yeah, they sort of progressed as the mill progressed. But we had no money. I mean, we had to cobble together the money for materials to run the work camp.
Effectively, what we did was we'd got all these very, very cheap houses in Burnley, and as we did them up, we could sell them, and we used the money from the sale to fund the materials for doing the mill.
Yeah,
and it was that sort of thing. And so, we were sort of inching along in that sort of way, and we made quite a do of it, really. It was
so you say it was a 10-year process. That the idea that every single summer you would have a work camp coming along and sort of set out, right, this year we're going to get our floor down, or this year we're going to get this done. So that's a really long-term project. And what was happening? Were people living in the houses, or were you all slowly kind of how was that working?
At the start, when we were doing the bulk of the work, we were living in Burnley Wood in the houses, and we would go out there to work on it. And then, it took quite a long time before we split it into 2 halves. So there was the long side and the square side, and we were working on the long side. And when that was basically completed, although it does, we'd done the bare bones of it, the roof and the floors and the windows, once they were in, we had to decide how to actually do the layout. Well, I seem to recall us going to the local swimming baths where you could go into the cafe early in the morning, put the kids in the creche, and we'd sit there and discuss, if you have that room, where would the rest of us go?
So it was dividing it up, and of course Chris has already mentioned that most of your decision making was by consensus.
It was, and it was quite clearly, there were lots of tricky issues. Who's got a relationship with who, and how do they feel being next door to somebody else? So it was a very entertaining series of meetings, really. Anyway, we ironed it out, and so then we were able to do all the, subdividing and putting up walls, and the other thing I suppose we should say about it is we wanted it to be very much an eco building, didn't we? We wanted it to be very well insulated, very sound insulated, warm. We had all sorts of things that we tried, not all successfully, one has to say. The mice loved the insulating in the walls, didn't they?
Yep. There were some crucial moments that I remember over that 10 years or whatever it took us. One was when we got refused the grants, there was a real serious discussion about whether we should sell it and forget it, that this wasn't achievable. And that was when we came up with this plan that we could slowly sell off our houses in Burnley Wood and use the money. And we set up at one point where we would work on outside jobs for other people, earn some money that would allow us to work for 6 months on the mill. So we were juggling being on, and for that period we were on benefits. So, and because we were income sharing, that was possible. You could juggle those sort of things. And we were even caught out by the Social Security police at one point.
They came to investigate.
Yeah.
Whether we were
working and claiming benefits.
Yeah, which we weren't. So
we were doing our own house up. That's how we told them, and they accepted it. And when the fact that it was a housing co-op, I don't know, either confused them or they didn't understand.
That's a grey area, isn't it? So they turn up and you've got all the materials and the work parties, and
we're all in our we're going to sign on in our works van.
Now that does bring me. I have to ask you about something called rapid transformations.
Well, that was another iconic point, I think. If we hadn't managed to get the roof done. So you can do so much with an IVS work camp with people who are basically unskilled labour. But if you want to replace a roof on a 3-story building, you've got to get skilled people in. Rapid transformations already existed. It's not something that was invented for the mill. It's I don't quite know who set it up to start with, but it was a group that got together pretty much every summer for a number of years from individuals from different communities around the country. And I think initially offered to do a job that you as your community couldn't manage. And it became re-roofing. And they turned up, they had a bus, a converted single-decker bus, which was parked at Lifespan, and as their base. And the deal was you had to provide the materials, you had to feed them. So we were used to doing this for IBS. And you had to provide space for their tent sauna, and you had to provide them a bottle of whiskey, and that was it.
And they would one single bottle or
one single bottle of whiskey. That was all they asked for. And their sauna was a frame tent with a wood stove in it.
That was their criteria, as to allow them space for their sauna and a bottle of whiskey.
Yep, that was the only payment.
Well, we had to strip a roof off of a local barn.
Well, yeah, we had to provide materials and all sorts of things. We had to put scaffolding up on a 3-story building.
Oh, yeah, we did. Yeah.
Ourselves. But what you got was some really skilled builders who would come. I mean, there was Keith, who was an architect. There were people who knew how to do this scale of job. And they turned up and we re-roofed half the building.
And they taught us how all those skills really as we went, so that when we wanted to do the other side, we could. So that was...
So all of these people who were in rapid transformations, they were essentially other community members. They were a bunch of people who decided that their holiday was to go off in a big van and go and do someone else's building job. I bet that was amazing in terms of, I don't know, sharing news, sharing skills, thinking about where everybody else lived. Did they visit other communities and did you hear about that?
Yeah.
There was a sort of deal that you were expected to provide somebody for their next project the following year. So they did Lifespan. They did some work at Lifespan the following year, and I went and worked on that project. So there was a bit of a rolling, we need to keep enough people doing this, but they did work at Lauriston, Crabapple. I think they even did an international job in Denmark. Took the whole bus over to Denmark. I mean, it was an amazing organisation. I mean, or disorganisation.
Wasn't it, really? It was, it was a bunch of friends who liked to spend time with each other.
Yeah.
And just brilliant, actually. Yeah.
I mean, I put that down. That was the point that I thought we can do this now. This is going to work. And
so that created the tipping point for you to sort of go, actually, this huge mill with this because the roofs, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to just stand there looking at it going, right, we've got to get this, not only have we got to strip this down, but we've got to get everything back up there. And you were saying about, kind of money must have been really tight.
It took so long, it became possible, didn't it? Because we could keep on, people were working some of the time and earning, and we lived incredibly frugally. Like we were saying last time, when you're sharing the resources, you can live very cheaply.
I mean, I think people left because it was taking so long.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that we had a turnover of people who are going, oh God, I can't wait another 5 years or forever. That people who couldn't just go.
Couldn't see it happening, couldn't see it finishing. Yeah,
there was a wonderful. I mean, maybe it was when we were having one of these meetings, but one of our kids said, "I don't want to move into the mill, because I don't want to live in a house with holes in the floor." And we went, no, the holes will be fixed. We won't ask you to move in. So even the kids couldn't imagine what we were talking about.
So were they two different? So you've got just to try and make sense of this a little bit, you've got your housing cooperative in Burnley.
Yeah.
Were you two separate entities, or was one an extension of the other? How did you become People in Common?
We were already People in Common, but we'd got the way we were living communally was to have 7 or 8 houses and go and eat together in one of them, and do shared projects. So we were running the building co-op some of the time, and then in our spare time we were working on the mill. And some people never worked in the building co-op. They would do other, work on summer play schemes that the council were running, that sort of thing. Or they'd be running a delivery van, a man in a van job. To some extent, how we were living in Burnley Wood was a way of life, and the mill was a sort of aspiration that was gradually, very, very gradually coming along, wasn't it? You just have to have both.
So you talked about dividing up the spaces, or at least talking about dividing up the spaces. Tell me about that transition from the housing cooperative in Burnley Wood, and sort of, did you eventually sell all the houses and moving in? How did that all work?
We didn't sell all the houses. because you're faced with a problem. If you slowly sell off the houses you live in, you have to contract and live in less and less terraced houses. So there comes a point where you're selling the roof over your head to move into a building that's not finished. So I've got a vague feeling we got a little bit of grant money to do a bit of investigation into private mortgages for housing co-ops, building society mortgages for housing co-ops, and from the Co-op Development Agency. And we came up with this plan that if we could get mortgages on the houses, we could sell them to another co-op. We could set up another co-op and sell the houses to that and get the money to finish the mill off. And that's when there became two separate co-ops, largely made up of the same people.
This is sounding very interesting, Chris.
One with a derelict mill. This is creative accounting. So we set up what was called Burnley Wood Housing Co-op, which went on to have a life after we moved to the mill and housed other people as a more traditional, less communal housing co-op. And that released the money. So we got mortgages. We're talking about small mortgages. The houses were only even by then worth thousands, a few £1,000s. So where we'd bought them for a few hundred in the 70s, early 80s. So we managed to release some finance, and we could stay on living in the houses in Burnley Wood until the mill was ready to move in. So, yeah, it did sort of work the way you were suggesting, but we had to be very imaginative, very creative with it.
Yeah, so essentially freeing up equity in order to finish off the mill, so you'd be at a point where you could actually move into the mill. Yeah.
Some people will have been members of Burnley Wood Housing Co-op, wouldn't they, before they moved across?
Yeah. And Burnley Wood Housing Co-op continued, I don't know when it was eventually wound up, largely to do with clearance. It was in all the houses pretty much gone. All the houses we lived in Burnley Wood pretty much gone now as a clearance programme for the City Council.
So did you all move in? Was there a moving in day, or was it a slow creep? How did that all work?
Do you want the story about us consulting an astrologer?
I want all the stories.
Right, okay. Slightly with our tongue in the cheek, we were going, how do you choose a moving in day? And I don't know how we knew this astrologer. Of course, the astrologer was in Hebden Bridge. And of course, and I don't know how we knew him. We said, well, he said, I could sort of find an auspicious day for you to move in. And we went slightly with a tongue in cheek, went, okay, yeah, do us a horoscope for a good day next summer for us to move in. And it turned out to be a day, half of us were on holiday. So we ceremonially moved something from everybody's room in Burnley, in their houses, into their room in the mill. And then we slowly moved in over time.
So what? So if you were on holiday, you might have like a pair of socks.
I think if we tried to do it something more symbolic than a pair of socks, something that might have, a little bit of furniture or your guitar or something. But and I mean, mostly we didn't make a big deal about the actual move-in, but we threw a whole load of parties in the few months and the sort of 6 months afterwards. We had a thing we called the Hoot Nanny Jamboree, which was a party that we invited everybody we knew to, and the only condition was you had to perform at the party. You had to do something, and there was a scratch choir in case people turned up and with nothing prepared. And we had a great kids party. We buried actual treasure out on the field and with X marks the spot, and they had a huge treasure hunt. Yeah, I mean,
to describe your space, you had big parties, and I'm assuming you could have big parties. What was your space like to be able to do that?
It moved. There were 3 of these parties, weren't there? And they were in different spaces pretty much each time, weren't they? And usually it'd be a space that was not yet completed.
So when we moved in, we'd moved into half the building.
Yeah, but even within that, it wasn't completed, was it? No. So the first one was in what was going to be the dining room in the long side. And in fact, I think it was before we put up all the petitions in it. I think so. It was a huge space, really. Enough for 100 people anyway. And it was fantastic. We had 4 hours of performances.
Yeah, and people came from other communities and all our friends locally. Yeah. And
did you have a ceremony? Did you do I know that people break bottles over things or cut ribbons or do a time capsule, or did you do any of those kind of marking the moment?
We did do a time capsule somewhere.
Yeah.
As I recall.
Yeah, and
but it wasn't part of a big event. It was
we were all very casual about these sort of things. I mean, I remember the time capsule. I remember just sitting around with a few friends in one of the rooms. We decided it was going to go into a recess in the wall, and then we were going to brick it in. And I remember our son Finn, who must have been 9 or something, and he put a balloon in, and the instructions on what a balloon was and how to use it.
So that the people of the future...
Yeah, in case they didn't know what a balloon was.
Oh, very sensible.
And a friend of ours who just happened to be there took off her watch and put it in. That's my vivid... That's all I can remember. I can't remember what else is in it.
When you have your exhibition that you're having to commemorate the 50-year anniversary, you'll have to get people to write in to say what they think they put in the time capsule.
Oh, right.
Or maybe ideas for a second one.
Yeah, my guess is that the people who live there now are not aware that there is a time capsule.
It could be quite dangerous for the solid wall. Anybody wants to go looking for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds amazing. Is there anything, so you all moved in, did that just settled down?
When I moved in, I didn't move straight into the mill. I moved into a caravan, and that's what a lot of us did, didn't we? We spent a bit, probably a year in a caravan whilst the room was getting completed. It still took forever, but eventually we did, everybody eventually got in, and the caravans were put to other uses. Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, when we did move in, that was only half the mill finished. And there was all the square side to be thought about, and the basement, and the boiler house. There was a lot still to be done. So it wasn't as if you felt as if you'd finished. It was a stage, really. But it did open up new possibilities, different possibilities of work and so on.
Now, I'm aware that we've probably got about 5 minutes left if we're going to stick to the time thing. But I've got 2 questions, I guess. One is, how long did you stay there? Sort of what were your abiding memories of it, or at least your one memory that stands out? And then just any messages, really. We are asking all of our podcast guests to say, is there any learning or anything that you've learned as your process of going through all of this that you'd like to share out with people who are listening? So, Chris, can I start with you? Sort of enduring memories and any tips, hints, or things that you think would be useful?
I mean, enduring memories of living at the mill. I mean, we moved in sort of late 80s, 89, 88, 89, and I left in 98. So I was there for another 10 years living at the mill. And we developed a business which in fact grew out of us renovating the mill, dealing with local timber. And that was having the resource to do that. And part of the resource was having the land, having the workshops, and you could develop that. And the skills that we'd learnt to a large extent on working on the mill allowed us to set up a business that was successful for
25 years, I think.
25 years in the end. And in some ways established a whole local tradition of dealing with local timber. And some of that is still going on. There's still people at the mill now who are continuing that on lower key than when we were doing it. So, and that was a huge opportunity. I mean, that really did feel like we're in a successful business, a successful cooperative business, where before, when we'd been running the building co-op, we were reliant on improvement grants and things like that. It felt different. It felt somehow like this was proper business, serious business. We were doing very high quality work at times for, with local timber. I mean, in terms of lessons I've learnt, be creative. I mean, it's like we did demand the impossible now, and then found a way to make it work. Now, turned into 10 years in terms of doing the mill, but like you said at the beginning, my parents thought this was a crazy thing we were doing, and yet we did it. And the fact that it's still going, there are still people living there. They're still doing things that I find very reminiscent of things we did. I know they for a while ran a forest school and things. So it's, we created something for 50 years. We took something out of the sort of normal housing, real problematic housing market, and created something different. And demand the impossible now, and then find a way to do it. Now, I mean, that's a bit glib, but yeah, there is a way through somehow. I mean, I know you've done a podcast on the commune in the north. I mean, I've had long talks with Kath about it, and she is really inspired by what we did at People in Common. I mean, it's part of the inspiration for what she's trying to do.
I think it's really important for people to hear these stories, and also to hear that some of it was done on just sheer open-mindedness, creativity, and a breath of fresh air. Really, it doesn't take millions. It just takes really applied thinking and doing. Yeah, Barbara.
Yeah, I mean, whatever solutions we found wouldn't be the right solutions in the future, for sure. And so I think Chris is right. It was about thinking outside of the box and seeing what opportunities are available and what you can do. I went for an ordinary, interestingly, I went for an ordinary job working for a local council in credit unions later on. And I got the job, and I was a bit surprised because, I didn't have any obvious qualifications for it in some ways. Well, I had some, but not necessarily. I thought there might be better candidates out there. And they said to me, well, one of the reasons was because of what you'd done at the mill, that we'd achieved something which people usually think of as impossible. So that legacy of thinking creatively had been really useful. And I suppose the things that I have taken from my experiences at Mill are that if you follow doing the things that you really enjoy and want to be doing, and get the qualifications that you really enjoy and want to be doing, they lead somewhere. As you develop, that it all comes together, and suddenly your dream job or your dream life experience can suddenly appear, and you're ready for it, so to speak. And the other thing is that the less you've got, if you pool your resources, you can just do amazing things.
Brilliant. Thank you both. It's been really, really interesting, a real journey for us to have been able to go through. There'll be some information underneath this podcast, but also just to note that we're hoping that we might be able to invite somebody from People in Common who lives there right now. So there might be a part 3, but thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting. Thanks both.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.